Well, joining me now from Berlin is Katja Kull. She is a member of the Greens political party in the German parliament. In the city of Frankfurt in Germany, Zafer Mese is there for us. He is the Berlin General Coordinator for SETA, a think tank focused on Turkey. And with me here in the studio is Magdalena Kirchner, a researcher at the Istanbul Policy Center. It's an NGO that specializes in regional issues. Thank you, all three of you, for your time. Zafer, let's start with you. And this issue of the clause in the deal when Germany originally in the 80s and 90s sold those tanks to Turkey, the clause being that the tanks could only be used for self-defense. Is that a very particular clause only included because the weapons were being sold to Turkey, or is that normal German policy, do you know?
Well, especially in the German arms deals regulation on the German government side, there are restrictions. It's not only tailor-made for Turkey. So when arms are exported, so they have a certain set of standards. And in this case, for example, for the Leopard tanks, right? This is it's for self-defense. This is a clause. There is another one which says that the resale of the tanks to third countries can be done only with the permission of the German government. But there is no, let's say, any kind of condition that Turkey cannot use it in the near abroad or whatsoever. So the issue is here. The definition of self-defense. Indeed, the Operation Olive Branch is, from the Turkish point of view, a proactive self-defense, which they already, let's say, announced. And the United Nations, NATO, even Germany has accepted the reason why Turkey is in Syria within the frame of the Operation Olive Branch.
Katja, that's a very interesting point, is it not? How can Germany determine what another country regards as its self-defense?
Well, self-defense is not defined by every country differently. Self-defense is defined by the international law. And what we see happening in the north of Syria is not self-defense. It is illegitimate and illegal intervention into another country. And it's a breach with the sovereignty of the Syrian territory. So we cannot talk of self-defense here, but we need to respect the Charter of the United Nations. And this is not the course. So the tanks that have been delivered for self-defense cannot be used in this course. And so we cannot accept more tanks to be delivered to Turkey in this situation.
Well, Zafer mentioned there Jens Stoltenberg, the boss of NATO, saying that all nations have the right to defend themselves when specifically talking about Turkey's Operation Olive Branch. And Katja, you mentioned the United Nations. The Dutch foreign minister referred to self-defense under international law and Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. And he, Halbe Zijlstra, said that there were clear attacks against Turkey which had given the country sufficient grounds to defend itself. So that's another EU member disagreeing with your stance about the legitimacy of Operation Olive Branch. What do you say to that?
Well, there might be a disagreement on that, but still I make this point. There might be shootings going on in the frontier area between Syria and Turkey, but an offensive military intervention into Syrian territory is definitely unproportionate and is not covered by self-defense by Article 51 of the UN Charter. and it is causing civilians casualties. So this intervention has to stop, and we need to find a political solution. We need a diplomatic way to find peace for Syria, but not striving for military escalation. That is not a way, not in the interest of the Syrian people. It's not in the interest of the international community, and it also is not in the interest of the Turkish people who want to live in peace with their neighbors.
Magdalena Kirchner, there's undoubtedly disagreement around the world about Turkey's reasons for Operation Olive Branch. But you, before we came into the studio, said that, you know, since these tanks were originally sold back in the 80s and then the 90s, the idea of internal and external threats has kind of shifted a little bit. Can you explain more about what we were talking about before we came in here?
Yeah, and I think whether there is support for the operation from an Article 51 position, and I think that was also made clear by referring to the statements, even by the federal government, there is no consensus yet on the question, what is the fight against terrorism? Is it a war that can be fought under Article 5? And the exports that you mentioned, Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, the exports that you mentioned of the 80s and the 90s, they were explicitly tied to territorial defense. And we had in Germany a discussion about the way tanks sold to Turkey were used domestically. To prevent such a scenario, there was a clause that this was only shaped to territorial defense. But then after 9/11 and the war on terrorism, there is a new discussion about even Article 5 can be invoked. It was invoked one time after a terrorist attack. So of course, I would say no NATO member would disagree with the statement that you can use to fight a terrorist organization. You can use military force. I think the question, and that Katja quite impressively spoke to, is what's the consequence for Germany as an arms exporter if the legal regulations don't match with our ethic or political ideas how these exports should be done? And I think that's the crisis that we're in right now.
Zafer, what is the German government's position regarding Operation Olive Branch specifically?
Well, the position of we have to say, the recent caretaker government. We are still in search for the grand coalition here. You know, it's a caretaker government. The caretaker government there was no harsh protest from the German government, and even they understand the argumentation of Turkey. And the issue was a case in Germany when the image of Leopard 2 tanks were, let's say, in newspapers. So then the German government had to make a balance act between pleasing the public opinion in Germany, and on the other hand, not to irritate Turkey due to the fact that they have now started to ease their tensions. So the solution was not to cancel, not to create do some kind of embargo, but to postpone it to the next grand cabinet. Which will be most probably in March in office. And now you can read between the lines that Germany has no interest in further escalating the bilateral relations. Quite the contrast. Both sides are very committed to ease the tensions, and they have started backdoor diplomacy. There is a communication between the two foreign ministers instead of megaphone diplomacy, what we had the recent 2.5 years. So the issue is really that both countries don't want to go where we're there until before 6-7 months.
How do you feel the German government, Katja, has dealt with this delicate balancing act that Zafer is talking about? Being a member of the oppositions in the Greens, it's very easy to disagree with government policy because you're in opposition. You don't have to run the country. But are you happy with the way the government is dealing with its relations with Turkey?
Well, I agree completely that we need an ease of tension. We need to get into a better relationship with each other, but we cannot put weapon exports on the top of that. So what we see now is not only a public debate, but it is about German regulations about weapon exports. Because our regulations are pretty clear. They say there is no export of arms if there is a danger of violating human rights or of escalating a military conflict. And that also applies to NATO countries. Of course, usually a NATO partner country can have easier conditions for weapon control, but if there is a risk of escalating military conflicts, then even a NATO partner will be denied German exports. So this is also a legal question, and not only one that is a tactical one for the next 3 months. It is a fundamental value that we are talking about, and hopefully we'll get over the need of those weapon controls. We need diplomatic relations, we need a political solution, and we need peace for Syria.
Zafer, go ahead.
Well, can I pick up on that?
Of course.
I mean, I think there is, I do understand the colleague who just mentioned the conditions for the export of arms, but isn't it kind of a hypocrisy to, if you look in 2016 what happened? The top importer of German arms is Algeria with 1.36 billion euros. The top 10 list also features Middle Eastern nations like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates, who are really actively involved in the human catastrophe, in the war in Yemen. So how can you bring these things together? So I think there is some kind of hypocrisy on that. So that means we have to be also very openly discuss the issues then in general, of course. But I have the impression that the focus on Turkey is a very passionate one, you know.
Okay, and, Zafer, one moment there. One moment, Zafer. Okay.
The figure for 2000, yes.
Just one moment.
Okay.
Katja, you have a right to reply.
Well, I agree completely that there's too many weapons, too many German arms exported into countries that are not EU or NATO partners. So there is, of course, also a disagreement among the opposition and the German government, of course. But I think we should look at. Yeah, we should look fair to it, and we were, as Greens, we were in coalition negotiations, and we tried to find agree on non-exporting arms for Saudi Arabia and for Egypt as well. So don't forget about this. This was a strong point, and even the parties who are negotiating right now so far agreed on that point, that no more arms should be exported to Saudi Arabia and all neighbor countries involved in the conflict in Yemen. So there is a debate about this. I just want to make clear on that point.
Okay, Magdalena, time to bring you in. In 2016, there were $35 billion worth of bilateral trade between Germany and Turkey. This is a very important relationship in terms of the economic partnership of the two countries as well. Since the failed coup attempt here in Turkey, relations have deteriorated. As we've heard from the guests, there are moves to improve those relations, which you well know. One of the issues that Turkey has with Germany is that it feels the German government doesn't clamp down hard enough on the PKK. The United States, the European Union, Turkey as well, all regard the PKK as a terror organization. President Erdogan says there are too many fundraising events taking place with the PKK in Germany. There are marches going on. The police don't break them up. The PKK is banned in Germany. We know that. But is there a defense from the German government to Erdogan's accusations? That would help improve relations if Erdogan was to get some of his concessions regarding the PKK terror group from the German government.
Well, I would say first you saw in the last month that there were signals, there were some moves and initiatives from the federal government, but in the case of the PKK, much more important from local government. And state governments and municipalities to be more strict regarding especially the demonstration of certain symbols and pictures of Abdullah Öcalan. The problem is, I think there's a lack of information on the Turkish side on how the German system works. It is very decentralized, so the federal government doesn't have the chance or the legal rights to rein in. But of course, it can send more symbolic messages, and I think it did. Also, the way the demonstration on the weekend in Cologne was solved also showed that there is a political interest in not giving Turkey the impression that Germany would support PKK, would tolerate it. But of course, there is a limit, and I think the expectations from the Turkish side sometimes don't really meet the German reality. I think in the case of the YPG, PKK dilemma, German authorities did a better job than, for instance, the US in making clear they do not want, for whatever reasons, that we don't want to have the idea or the pictures of cooperation in the Syrian theater, although YPG and PYD are not banned as organizations in Germany. Whenever they were used in the context of PKK, there is also an expansion of the ban of symbols.
Magdalena Kirchner, thank you very much indeed. Zafer Mese and Katja Kull, both of you in Germany as well, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers, all three of you.